Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, for me, I know I'm actually buying something off Facebook. It's a little kit. It's four $100 panels, and it's got everything. It's already hooked up. So I just want that so I can play with it to get
Yeah.
an understanding of what's going on. Because right now I don't know if I want to do installation or sales, but I'm very intrigued by solar so far.
Well, that's good. Yeah, if you get an option, if you get a chance, maybe put together one of those solar generators, and play around with that. You'll have a pretty good understanding about standalone systems if you do that.
Okay.
So let's see. I'm sort of walking through the table of contents up to where we are thinking about um, the IV curve is something that sometimes messes people up. Jake, did you have a comment? I think before about that.
Just as I was going through, I was taking notes on this stuff, and uh, like off the top of my head, I'm not doing real well with like memorizing which one is which, but like I'm taking the notes and like working on it. You know what I mean? Um, like what each one of those three-letter abbreviations stands for, like
Yeah.
right off the
Yeah.
top of my head. Like,
Yeah.
Would it
but
be helpful if I drew out the IV curve and went over that at this stage? Would that be helpful to anybody?
Like
I don't think it wouldn't be helpful.
It's not okay. I'll take 3 minutes here. Let me get my whiteboard just to review this, because this is one of those things that if you don't get it, then it's gonna be
Harder later on. Yeah.
problematic. So all
Okay.
right. So everybody see the screen, the white screen?
Yeah.
yeah.
All right. So if we have an IV curve, so this is usually referred to as the IV curve, and I for amps, V for volts. And I think we brought up about, is it always the I on the side and the V on the bottom? That tends to be the way we do it. And then your IV curve is always going to look something in this kind of shape. And
Hmm.
this curve is always going to be in watts, because amps times volts gives you watts. And the analogy that I like to use for this is, well, at some point along this curve, the maximum amount of power is going to be generated. And it's usually right in this bend. And that is what we refer to as the maximum power point, the MPP. Sometimes they call it the Pmax. And it's just in watts, the maximum power point. And remember, this curve is at STC. There's an infinite number of curves based on different conditions. If the temperature goes up, the curve will be slightly different. If a cloud passes in front of the sky, over the in front of the sun, it's going to be slightly different. So this is a curve that only is at STC, and STC means 25 degrees Celsius, 1,000 watts per square meter, 1.5 atmospheres. So this is our curve. So why does the power get generated here maximum? Well, what you'll find is if we put some numbers in here, this is always going to be 0. So let's say 0.5, 1 amp, 1.5 amps, 2, 2.5, and 3. Let's just say that's how many amps. And here we got 5 volts, 10 volts, 15, 20, 25, 30, and let's say 35. Okay. I'm just taking random numbers at the moment. So if we're operating at 5 volts, we're going to have about 15 watts, 3 times 5. If we move that to 10 volts, we're going to have somewhere close to 30 watts operating here. If we increase the voltage to 15 volts, well, it's not quite 3. Let's say it's 2.9 or whatever. Well, then that's going to be, if it was 3, it would be 45. So let's say 40 3 watts. And then we come out here to 20 and then we're at 2.5. So now it's at 50 watts. And now we're at 25 and it's at just under 2.5. So let's say here it's going to be at about 72 watts, or let's just say 70 watt, just for clarity. So 70 watts. And then we come out to 25 and it's at 2 watts or 2 amps. So now we're back down to 50. And then at 30, if it's 1.5, we're at 45. And then at 35.5, now we're down to like 17. So notice as we do the numbers, we hit a certain point and that's the maximum power. And in this case, we would call this panel a 70 watt panel because we just refer to it at its maximum power point under standard test conditions. So this would be a 70 watt panel. Well, it only operates at 70 watts under standard test conditions. So why is it that it goes up and then it begins to go down? Well, an analogy that I like is to think about watts, like how many cars are going through an intersection. And if you keep adding cars, let's say the number of cars is the voltage. If I keep adding them, traffic is going to, through the intersection, is going to increase until they start to interfere with each other. Somebody taps a brake and all of a sudden, you know, things slow down. And the more cars you add, from this point forward, every car you add means less traffic goes through the intersection until you get to complete and utter gridlock, which is down here. And that would be at VOC. It's the theoretical maximum number of cars, but nothing's moving. So in this case, it's the theoretical maximum voltage, but there's no power. It's at 0. Nothing is moving. Same thing over here. The ISC is the theoretical maximum amperage, but there's no power. So both of those conditions are bad. You know, I mean, you don't want your system operating there. But when we design our systems, we use these numbers because they are the theoretical maximums. So when I want to design wire size, I'm worried about what's the most amps that might be in, you know, that might flow through that wire. So I'm going to use the theoretical maximum amps, even though the system's never going to operate there. So I would use that in sizing wire. And I would use the VOC when I'm designing to make sure I don't exceed a certain voltage. You know, so I don't want it to exceed 600 volts because that's what the National Electrical Code says is the limit. So I'm going to use VOC. But the operating voltage in this case is going to be somewhere around here. That's my VMP, my voltage at the maximum power point. And then there is an ISC or IMP, sorry, which is the amperage when you're operating at the maximum power point. So these are operational points. The IMP, which is the amps when everything's working properly, and the volts when everything's working properly, and it's at its maximum power point. How do we determine that it stays at its maximum power point? Well, there's a little device in every single piece of electronics that's hooked up to your system called the maximum power point tracking device. And what that does in a grid-tied system, it's in the inverter. It just makes sure that the panel operates at its maximum power point. So it keeps changing things so it's always at its best. As conditions change, that MPPT is going to adjust and it's going to be at the sweet spot all the time. So it's going to operate at the MPPT or at the MPP. These are just design criteria. The ISC and the VOC are just design limitations. So we use that in design. We use this in operation.
But you said that would be indicated as a 70 watt panel, but it could actually go higher than the STC because of weather conditions, right?
Yeah, the colder it gets, the higher it gets.
Okay, so and then that's called the open circuit, right?
No,
the short circuit.
No, the open, those are based on any line. Here, let me just show you what the reality is. Okay, so let's say that I've got, this is my STC curve. Let's say it gets colder. Well, temperature typically affects volts. So now I'm going to see the curve actually goes something like this. And let's say it gets hotter. Well, now the curve is going to be something like this, less volts. My maximum power point shifts along these curves. So the MPPT has to keep adjusting it. Well, let's say this is 70 watts. Well, let's say it gets colder at my MPP maximum power point, it might be actually up to 75 watts, but it's not at the VOC. It's still at the VMP, but the VMP has increased. So you're going to operate at the VMP for voltage all the time, and it can exceed the nominal voltage of the panel, the rated voltage, because this voltage or this wattage is all determined at STC. So the colder it gets, the more power it might produce. Also, the other thing is amps. Let's say that it gets cloudy. Well, then my curve might go like this. You know, it got cloudy. This is at 1,000 watts per square meter. Well, what is it at 600 watts per square meter? The curve might look like that. So now my MPPT might have shifted over here. You know, so it's always adjusting, always adjusting. Well, remember, 1,000 watts per meter squared or per square meter is what we call standard test conditions, but you can have conditions where there's more light than that. At the outside edge of the Earth's atmosphere, the solar constant is about 1,360 watts per meter squared, per square meter. Well, on a clear day, I've gotten measurements that show like 1,200 watts per square meter. So your amps might actually increase as well, you know, over what STC says. So all this is a comparison, you know, between one panel and another. It does not mean that that's where it's going to be operating. It can be better, it can be worse, you know, given the conditions of the day. Which is why once we get into the wiring sizing, I think we did some of that already. If my amperage rating based on ISC here is, let's say, 9.6 amps, I multiply that times 1.25 because the National Electrical Code says I always want to give myself a margin of error. Right? Every single circuit you design in solar, in electrical, heating and air conditioning, whatever, you're always going to have that 1.25 safety margin. But in solar, they say before you hit the first piece of electronics, put in another 1.25 variability of solar margin. And that's because of this, because we can experience days where you're actually getting more sunlight than what it was rated for at STC. So under this scenario, we would then take 9.6 times 1.25 times 1.25, and it would be, find my calculator, 9.6 times 1.25 times 1.25 is 15. So that's going to be 15 amps. So now I need to make all of my designs so the wire can handle at least 15 amps, even though we think it's only going to carry 9.6. Okay. Does that all make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
We just got to remember to use the 1.25 twice, or I do.
Yeah. That's a common mistake. But remember, it's only until it gets to the first electronic device that then begins to modulate or modify based, you know, it filters out that variability of sunlight once it hits an electronic device. And with a lot of our systems now, we put an electronic device on the solar panel. So if you're using a microinverter or you're using a power optimizer, you don't have to put in that second 1.25 because the optimizer or the microinverter is already accommodating, the output from that unit is going to filter out that extra power from the sun. So it really now in today's market, that only applies to typically a ground mounted system that's connected to a string inverter, at which point you have to do the 1.25 times 1.25 all the way until it hits the inverter. And then at that point, it's mitigated or modified by the electronics. Hopefully that doesn't confuse the heck out of you. Okay, so what are some of the other issues? I know chapter 5 is a pretty big chapter. We get into all the different issues about junction boxes and combiner boxes versus junction boxes. One other thing that people often get confused about. Let me try and reinforce this. All right, so if I'm designing a typical standalone system, okay, so let's walk through all the bits. This is my solar array. What is the next thing I connect to?
The combiner box.
Yeah, combiner box or junction box, depending. And then from there, what do I connect to?
DC connect.
Yeah, DC disconnect.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yep, a DC disconnect to turn off. You want to be able to turn off at every power source. Then where do I go? This is a standalone system.
Inverter?
Not yet, standalone. If it were grid tied, that would be right.
Standalone. We're going to need battery.
A charge controller.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
And then from the charge controller, we go to battery, right? Mm-hmm. The whole purpose of a charge controller is to control the charge from the solar panel to the battery. So it's got to be located in between. From the battery, we go to, should be another DC disconnect of some sort because it's another power source. We want to be able to isolate it. From the DC disconnect, we go.
That's where the inverter.
Yeah, that's the inverter. We usually put an inverter, the symbol is like that with a diagonal line through it, because like half of it is DC and half of it is AC kind of thing. From here, where do we go?
Panel? AC panel?
Yeah, in fact, with a standalone, we can say the AC disconnect, but it's usually the main breaker in a service panel is going to be your AC disconnect. Okay, and then from there, we go to the loads, right? Everybody see that? And with a typical system, we might decide to add a generator, and then that would hook into your inverter. That would be a typical standalone system. Very, very common, very normal. You don't have to have the generator in this case, but a lot of people, if it's your only home, that's what you're doing. Now, what I wanted to reinforce with this, other than to walk through all the different parts, is when I turn on a load, how does the power flow? Okay. So I want to just make sure you understand, if I draw a line right here halfway through the battery, the solar array is going to push power into the battery. So the only purpose of the solar array is to recharge the battery. That's its sole purpose. Okay?
Recharge the battery or store the energy, right?
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Okay? Now, you can get a complicated charge controller that will allow you to use power in addition and bypass the battery. But for this purpose, I want you to just think of it this way. Okay? So the solar array charges the battery. So what happens when I turn on a load? Well, the load, the power gets drawn from the battery, flows through the inverter, it's converted to AC, and then flows to the load. Everybody see that? So you're drawing power from the battery and servicing the load, just like you would do with your laptop or whatever. I turn on my laptop, it pulls that power from the battery and services the load. For this purpose, I don't need a solar array. Just like with your laptop, I don't have a solar array connected to my laptop, you know, or I don't need any loads to recharge my battery. But if I don't have both of them, the system doesn't make a lot of sense, but they are acting independently of each other. The array charges the battery and the battery services the load. Everybody follow that concept?
Yeah.
Okay, so all of the power that is servicing the loads gets pulled through the inverter from the battery. Now, how do I size the inverter? How do I decide what size inverter I need?
Yeah, it has to match.
That goes off your load.
Yeah. Right. And the load is not the daily load. The daily load would be in like watt hours per day. What I'm worried about is the maximum power draw in watts. Right? So if I turned on everything that could be turned on all at the same time, that's my maximum power draw. And if I don't have an inverter big enough to handle all of that load that comes at it in just 1 second, that inverter is going to screech and shut down. You know, it's going to blow a fuse, a breaker, right? So I size my inverter in a standalone system based on the maximum power draw that the system could experience in any 1 second. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right.
I watched, Jay.
Yeah.
I watched the video last night, and he was pretty much drawing out the diagram just as you did. And what he said was that when you hold on, lost my train of thought. The loads. Oh yeah, about the inverter. He just made it the analogy that he was using a 2,000-watt inverter, and he gave me the analogy, or us the analogy, that it's basically that 2,000 watts is basically equivalent to a standalone outlet that'll produce about 1,800 watts. Is that about right? A regular outlet, your regular home outlet.
Okay.
If we had 15 amps, he was going off based off 15 amps, and he was just saying most. I'm assuming most residential would be 15 amps at the outlet. I'm assuming. I was just trying to.
Yeah, I don't know. That seems to be modern construction, although most of the homes I've lived in have 20 amp outlets at the 20 amp breakers in the box. But a lot of new construction is 15 amp breakers in the box. But yeah, so what I'm trying to get to is if you add up all of the loads, and let's say that all the maximum power draw is that at any one time, 2,000 watts could be drawn through the system. If I turn on all the lights and my refrigerator kicks on and my well pump kicks on and everything's happening all at the same time, the maximum is 2,000. Well, then my inverter better be able to handle 2,000 watts. Otherwise, it's like a circuit breaker. I plugged in too many things and it's just going to pop off. It's going to shut down. And then I got to reset it. But you don't want it operating at its maximum all the time. So we typically want to say 1.25 times. So in this case, if I am operating at 2,000 watts, I'd want to have a 2.5 kW inverter or maybe even a 3.0 kW inverter, just so that I'm not going to, tax my inverter too much. Does that all make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So for standalone systems, the inverter sizing is based on the load. For a grid-tied system, it works differently. Okay. So how do we design a grid-tied system? We start with the array. What's the first thing that you connect to it?
Combiner box again.
Combiner box or a junction box, depending on if you're combining the loads in parallel or not. From there, where do we go?
DC disconnect.
DC disconnect. So far, everything's the same. Then where do we go?
Charge controller.
No, it's grid tied. We don't have any batteries.
Yeah. Grid tied. Inverter.
Yep, straight to the inverter. From the inverter, where do we go?
DC disconnect.
No, it leaves at AC. So it's going to be an AC disconnect.
Okay.
Comes in as DC, leaves as AC. Okay. And remember, this AC disconnect's got to be located within 10 feet of the meter and externally operable and well marked, right? So from the AC disconnect for a load side connected system, where do I go?
Is that where we have a meter?
We're going to go to the service panel.
Okay.
Right? We're going to go into the circuit breaker box, and we're going to locate it as far away from the main breaker as possible on that service panel box because of the 120% rule, right? Everybody remember that one? If you don't, tell me, because I'll explain.
I kind of remember. So at the circuit breaker inside, you were saying that, if we had 100 amp or 200 amp AC disconnect. Go ahead, explain it again.
Yeah. So what you were on the right track. If the rating for this box was rated at 200 amps, and when you go down to Lowe's and you buy one of them or whatever, they're going to say it's a 200 amp box or it's a 100 amp box or whatever. And if I'm coming in from the utility, this is my meter, and I've got a 200 amp service from the utility and a 200 amp breaker, you might think, well, the rating of the panel is the same as how much power is coming in. Therefore, I can't add any more power because it's up to its maximum. But the NEC says you can go to 120% of whatever that number is with power input. So if I can go to 120% and I've got 200 amps coming in and it's 200 amp rated, that means I can put a 40 amp service breaker from my array. So that's the 120% rule. I can actually go to 120% of the rating of the bus bar in the service panel. But if I do that, I've got to locate it as far away from the breaker as possible. Basically, I don't want the power doubling up on itself on that. I want to feed it from opposite ends. That just reduces the stress. All right. So that's the 120% rule there. All right. So let's look at how the power flows, because this is now going to go out to the transformer at the pole from the meter. That's the electrical meter. And this is your system. So what happens when I turn on a load? Where does the power come from?
The utility.
Well, power is always going to flow from the nearest source. And if the sun is shining, the first bit of power is going to go from the array to the load directly. Okay? Because it's nearer. My solar array is nearer than the power plant that's servicing from the utility. So that's where the power is going to come from. Well, what happens if I don't have enough power from the array to service all the loads that I've turned on?
Grid picks it up.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the grid's going to supply me some as well, right? It's going to take everything I can generate from my array, and then it's going to supplement it with whatever else is coming from the grid. Does that all make sense? So what happens if I have more power than I need? What if my array is generating more power?
That's when it flows back out.
You're going to cause islanding.
Yeah. So then what's happening is it's going to service everything I need. The excess is going to go out to the grid. Right? Yeah. Everybody see that? Yeah. So basically, the load has, my inverter doesn't care what the load is. Right? In a standalone system, all of the load's power is flowing through the inverter. But in this case, only the load that is being serviced by the array is flowing through the inverter, because some of it comes straight from the grid, right? If I need to. So how do we size the inverter in a grid-tied system? It's dependent upon the size of the array, not the size of the load.
Okay.
Yep. That makes sense?
Yeah.
These things are correlated. They don't have to be exactly the same, but they're related. In fact, in today's world, they're typically not exactly the same. So for example, if I have a 5 kW solar array, you might think, okay, I need to have a 5 kW inverter. But you don't necessarily have to have it. And that gets into clipping. I don't want to confuse things at this point, but when you get into clipping, we'll explain a little bit more about why those don't have to be the same. But I could be drawing 10 kW over here, right, on my load. And if I was, and I have a 5 kW array, I'm going to send 5 kW from here and 5 kW from the grid. Right? Well, my inverter is only processing 5 kW. It's not processing 10 kW. It doesn't care. It doesn't care what the load is. So that's an important concept to remember. In a grid-tied array, the size of the inverter is based on the array. And in a standalone system, the size of the inverter is based on the maximum power draw of the load.
Okay.
It doesn't even care what size the array is. It could care less. Doesn't even have to have an array. You know, it can get recharged from a generator or something like that. So does that make sense, that particular concept?
Yeah.
One question, Jake.
Sure.
The meter, the utility company meter, that's going to go back and forth, right? As far as net metering?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's going to be bidirectional. So when you first sign up for a solar array to install one, if they haven't already installed a bidirectional meter, they're going to have to come out and swap out the meter. And the meters are no longer just those analog things that spin. You know, it used to have a little wheel in there that you could look at and you could see that little wheel spinning.
Yeah.
Now they're all digital, and it's going to cycle through like 3 numbers typically. The 3 numbers are going to be how much did you pull from the grid, how much did you send back to the grid, and what's the net amount. And the reason they do that is because they could charge you different rates for different things. So.
Hey Jay, those off topic, but those older meters that you used to spin in Chicago. I lived in Chicago, and there was a guy who he put a nickel on it. He opened it up, put a nickel on it, and slowed it down.
Yeah.
I was floored, but yeah.
Yep.
So
yeah, when I
figured that's why they got rid of those guys and said, no, we're going digital.
Yeah, you could manipulate those a little bit. That's why they always have the little clip on your meter box, because if you tamper with it, then it indicates that you've opened it up, because you could theoretically just jam something in there and keep it from spinning, and you'll get power, but you're just not getting enough power, or it's not measuring that power. So, it's that's the whole purpose of the meter, is just to measure flow back and forth, as it's going through that meter, so that you get billed for it. So, now who owns the meter?
In a grid tie system?
Yeah.
Both parties.
Yeah, kind of. Typically, the utility owns the meter, but the customer owns the box that the meter is in. So, and usually the customer has to pay for the meter, but they don't own it. So, your utility may come in and charge you $600 to put a new meter in it, and then you pay them, but you don't get it. It's not yours. So it's just kind of a ripoff. Our local utilities around here, they don't charge you for the meters, but I know, Randy, you and Jimmy are installing a new meter box, I think, over there at David, and that's going to be a utility disconnect box, and that is now required under 2023 code. So you've got to have a utility disconnect out there at the meter.
Okay.
Yeah, the way that works is, let's see if I go back to my screen share. I'm using the whiteboard quite a lot. Is typically like you've got a meter box here, and then with the newer systems, you're going to have what looks like a small circuit breaker box underneath of it. And there's going to be like a main disconnect here, and then a couple of 240 breakers down below. Well, this is now considered your main, and it's considered the main utility disconnect. So in the past, if they wanted to disconnect you from the utility, they'd have to come and pull your meter, or else turn it off at the transformer. Now what they're going to do is just come open up the box and just turn off this main, and now you're disconnected from the utility. Everything from that point forward is isolated.
And they can turn you off remotely.
Not in our area. I don't know. Maybe yours is more sophisticated. In our place here, what they'll typically do, in fact, I watched them do it when we installed part of our system, is up there at the transformer, that's up on the pole. They have a little connection, and there's like this little tiny fuse here that connects into the power lines. And they just had a long fiberglass pole, and they reached up with it and pulled that so that it was sort of dangling loose here.
Those are like drop fuses or whatever they're called. I forget.
Yeah, that sounds like a good name for it, because they just disconnected it. So now we didn't have power. And then when we're all done, they took that little fiberglass pole and reconnected it back up there, and then we had power. And the guy was like teaching his apprentice to do it, and the apprentice stood there for like 20 minutes trying to figure out how to get that little pole thing to disconnect, and the guy was giving him all sorts of hassle about it and everything. But so these are the way they're done. So anyway, so this is going to be really good when people start having these, because imagine I want to hook into a system like a solar array. And Jimmy and I were talking about this morning. You're up on the roof, and you've got a solar array up here, and you've got your microinverters. And so everything's up here, your microinverters. Well, you could just come down the side of the house, have an AC disconnect, and then just hook into one of these double pole breakers, and you've made your entire connection. So you don't even have to drill into the house to get to the service panel to hook up your solar array. You could just use one of these double pole breakers. So,
which is what we'll probably do.
Yeah, that's what we were just talking about, and that makes life super, super easy, for a solar installation. So then somebody's got to come work on it. Well, you just come and you disconnect that, turn off your AC disconnect. The whole system's dead. and you can just work on it. So with a typical microinverter system now, you know, with a combiner box, you're going to come in here to the combiner box, and so your system's going to look a little more like that, coming off the roof. And in this combiner box, you can typically come in with 4 20-amp breakers. So each of these breakers is going to be 20 amps. So I could come in with 80 amps total. So if I'm designing a system like that, even let's say I'm putting a 5 kW system up here, and it's only going to have, let's say, 5 kW, maybe it's got 15 amps. Let's say that's my power output in amps. Well, what I would do is, if I'm running wire down to the system, in this case, I would run wire that could handle 20 amps, even though I'm only going to be running 15, because I might expand this in the future and I don't want to have to pull new wire. It can go to a maximum of 20 amps. So coming in here, now I could do 4 of those, but for right now, I'm only doing 1. But then the wire that leaves here, I would rate that for 80 amps, because that's the maximum output from this box. Okay. And then, so I would have an 80 amp AC disconnect, and then I would use 80 amp wire here. But then the breaker where I'm connecting in, because I'm only doing 15 amps right now, I'd have to put a 15 amp breaker. Does that make sense to everybody? So yeah. if I upgrade my system in the future, I don't have to change any of the wire, but I will have to put in a different breaker. You know, well, that's not a big deal.
Yeah.
So you know, design your wiring system for the maximum that the equipment will allow for. That's kind of where we're at, because if you do upgrade in the future, it saves a lot of hassle. Okay. Anybody else have any other questions? I know we've gone off into, I mean, you didn't have any questions to begin with, but anyway, you know, that gives us a little bit of review. Next Tuesday, we're definitely going to get into, I mean, this is the week where your brains are going to explode a little bit, as you start getting into the math. So just be prepared for that. And we'll work through some of those problems, but if you get frustrated, if you run into a problem, don't just throw your hands up, you know, make note of it, and then we'll cover it in the meeting. So that I expect you guys next week to come prepared with all sorts of problems. So,
hey, Randy and Jake, are you guys installed? Like, are you guys in solar already?
No, I'm not.
I mean, I am. I'm working with somebody now, so we're about to do solar.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, he's doing electrical right now, but they're evolving into solar.
Yeah. Jay, also, I don't know if I was listening to you or I read it. It was something I saw where in California that they were mandating, like, all the new houses, they have to be built with solar.
Yeah.
I heard that or read it somewhere this morning. I was just like, wow, because I mean that's going to be huge, you know, as we grow in this industry. So
yeah, already Hawaii, California, and Maryland all now say any new houses have to have solar. Hawaii or California said no new houses can install natural gas. So they're eliminating natural gas as an option. And there are 13 other states that are considering mandating solar in all new construction. So, you know, it's definitely the wave of the future. And in, you know, in the session today, Solar Noon Tuesday, talked about the Tennessee Valley Authority. you know, they're going from having like 1.6 gigawatts of solar up to having like 18 gigawatts of solar. So it's changing. I mean, it's changing everything. So, you know, you're just at the beginning of it. You guys are like Steve Jobs learning about computers, you know, you're right at the beginning of that. So we're in the floppy disk age of solar.
Oh yeah.
Yep. All right. Well, I'll talk to you guys next week. And in the meantime, if you have any questions during the week, just give me a shout.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care.
Take it easy, guys.